The radar screen inside the concrete bunker at Godabia Air Base was a sea of green noise, punctuated by the rhythmic sweep of the scanner. It was the 19th of August, 1981. The air outside, hanging heavy over the Gulf of Sidra, was sweltering, but inside the command center, the atmosphere was freezing cold. A Soviet technical advisor, one of many stationed in Libya to oversee the integration of Moscow's finest hardware, stood silently behind the radar operators. He watched the glowing phosphorus blips with a mix of professional boredom and underlying tension. To the north lay the Mediterranean. To the south, the vast expanse of the Libyan desert. But the focus of the world on this morning was an invisible boundary drawn across the water, the line of death. Colonel Muammar Gaddafi had declared the entire Gulf of Sidra as sovereign territory, a claim no other nation recognized. The Americans, in a deliberate show of force, had sent a carrier battle group across that line. The advisor checked his watch. It was early morning. The Americans were conducting a missile exercise. The radar showed two distinct contacts patrolling the southern edge of the exercise zone. They were flying a combat air patrol pattern. They were the intruders. Vectors, the Libyan controller barked into his headset. Interceptor flight, Vector 360. Targets range 40 kilometers. Two Soviet-made Su-22 aircraft roared off the runway moments earlier. These were capable machines, swing-wing fighter bombers designed to fly low and fast. They were the pride of the export fleet, armed with AA-2 heat-seeking missiles. The pilots were confident. They had the numbers, they had the ground control support, and they were defending their home. The Soviet advisor leaned in. He knew the doctrine. The plan was simple. Intercept the intruders, force them to turn away, and assert dominance over the Gulf. It was a standard game of cat and mouse that had played out dozens of times during the Cold War. But today felt different. The American blips were not turning away, they were turning in. Targets are closing, the operator said, his voice tightening. Closing speed, high. On the scope, the geometry of the engagement began to collapse. The two pairs of aircraft were rushing toward each other at a combined speed of over 1,000 knots. This was a head-on merge. In aerial combat doctrine of the 1970s, a head-on pass was usually a stalemate. Heat-seeking missiles needed to see the hot exhaust of an engine, meaning you had to get behind the enemy to kill them. Radar missiles were unreliable at close range. The standard procedure was to pass each other, turn hard, and fight for the rear position. The Libyan lead pilot saw the grey shapes of the American fighters through his canopy. He made a split-second decision. He would not wait for the merge. He armed his missile. "Fox 1!" the pilot shouted over the radio. The Soviet advisor watched the telemetry. The Libyan Su-22 had fired a missile head-on. It was a bold, perhaps foolish move with an AA-2, but it showed aggression. The missile streaked away, trailing smoke. Then, the impossible happened. The American aircraft did not scatter. They did not panic. They broke formation in a maneuver so sharp and coordinated it looked mechanical. The lead American jet banked hard left, the wingman hard right. The Libyan missile passed harmlessly through the empty air between them. "Missed," the operator whispered. He missed. "Re-engage," the advisor muttered, expecting the dogfight to begin. He expected a turning battle, a swirling contest of energy and aerodynamics that would last several minutes. Instead, the radio erupted in static and screams. 6 seconds later, that was all it took. On the radar screen, the two American blips swung back inward, completing a bracket maneuver with terrifying precision. They didn't try to get behind the Su-22 aircraft. They simply pointed their noses at the passing Libyan jets. "Flash! Flash!" a voice screamed over the radio. "I'm hit! I'm ejecting!" The advisor stared at the scope. One of the Libyan blips vanished. The second Libyan pilot, realizing his wingman was gone, attempted to execute a hard defensive turn, trying to flee back toward the coast. He was pulling maximum G-force, straining the airframe to its limit. It shouldn't have mattered. He was moving away, fast. "Launch detected," the controller shouted. The second American fighter had fired, but the geometry was wrong. The angle was too steep. The distance was closing too fast. "Impact," the operator said, his voice hollow. The second Libyan blip disappeared. The room fell into a stunned silence. The Soviet advisor looked at the clock on the wall. From the moment the Libyan pilot had fired his missile to the moment both Su-22 aircraft were destroyed, less than 45 seconds had elapsed. Two advanced Soviet-supplied fighters, flown by aggressive pilots, had been swatting out of the sky before they even understood they were in a fight. The Americans hadn't just won. They had dismantled the engagement with a level of efficiency that defied the known laws of aerial combat. They didn't struggle. They didn't maneuver for position. They simply arrived, fired, and cleared the sky. The advisor felt a cold pit form in his stomach. He wasn't looking at a tactical defeat. He was looking at a technological abyss. If the Americans could shoot accurately from angles that should be impossible against aircraft that were technically sound, then every assumption the Soviet military had made about air superiority in Europe was wrong. This is the channel Cold War Impact. If you want to understand the hidden history of the conflicts that shaped our world, make sure you are subscribed. We investigate the technology, the spies, and the battles that the history books often overlook. Back in the bunker, the confusion was total. The Libyan commanders were shouting, demanding to know what happened. Was it a surface-to-air missile? Did they collide? No, the operator said, rewinding the tape of the radar intercept. They were shot down by the aircraft. Which aircraft? The commander demanded. Phantoms? Eagles? The Soviet advisor shook his head slowly. He knew what was out there. He had seen the silhouette reports in the intelligence briefings, blurry photos taken from long-range surveillance aircraft. It was the big naval fighter. The one with the variable sweep wings that the Americans claimed could track 6 targets at once. Tomcats, the advisor said quietly. But even knowing the name explained nothing. The F-14 Tomcat was supposed to be a heavy interceptor, a missile truck designed to defend the fleet from bombers at long range. It wasn't supposed to be able to dogfight small, agile jets like the Su-22. It certainly wasn't supposed to be able to kill them in a head-on merge or a high-deflection crossing shot. The report that would go back to Moscow that evening would be filled with technical data, but the subtext would be panic. The Americans had introduced a variable into the equation that the Soviets couldn't account for. They had weaponized geometry. As the rescue helicopters scrambled to fish the Libyan pilots out of the warm Mediterranean water, the 2 American fighters were already turning back toward their carrier, the USS Nimitz. They hadn't even used their afterburners to escape. They were calm. The mystery wasn't that the planes were shot down. In war, planes are lost. The mystery was the speed. How did a heavy, carrier-based interceptor destroy 2 agile fighters in under a minute without ever getting on their tails? The Soviet advisor needed answers, and he needed them before the next engagement. Because if this was the new standard of American air power, the Iron Curtain was defended by paper. In the halls of the Kremlin and the design bureaus of Mikoyan Gurevich, the 1981 disaster was rationalized. The report that eventually landed on the desks of Soviet air defense marshals contained a comforting lie. It was the wrong machine for the job. The Su-22 was a Striker, a ground attack aircraft with limited visibility and primitive radar. Sending it against the F-14 Tomcat was like sending a knife fighter to a sniper duel. The conclusion was that the Americans hadn't won because of superior technology. They had won because of a tactical mismatch. The solution was simple. Send a real fighter. By January 1989, the Libyan Air Force had been upgraded. They were now operating the MiG-23 Flogger. This was a completely different beast. Like the F-14, it featured variable geometry wings that could sweep back for high-speed intercepts or spread out for low-speed maneuvering. It had a powerful radar, the Sapphire II-3, and it carried medium-range R-23 missiles capable of engaging targets beyond visual range. On paper, the MiG-23 was a near-peer competitor to the American naval fighters. The stage was set for a rematch, and on January 4, 1989, the Americans returned. 2 F-14 Tomcats from the USS John F. Kennedy were patrolling over the Mediterranean, roughly 70 miles north of Tobruk. Their call signs were Gypsy 202 and Gypsy 207. Deep inside a hardened command bunker on the Libyan coast, the radar screens lit up. 2 contacts, hostile, moving south. This time, the Libyan pilots were not looking to patrol. They were looking for redemption. 2 MiG-23 aircraft launched, accelerating hard to supersonic speeds. The Soviet advisors monitoring the situation felt a surge of anticipation. This was the test case they had been waiting for. The MiG-23 pilots were instructed to be aggressive. The doctrine had evolved. Do not wait for the Americans to dictate the engagement. Close the distance. Force the merge. Use the MiG-23's superior acceleration to negate the American radar advantage. On the tactical display, the 4 aircraft rushed toward one another. The Americans were at 20,000 feet. The Libyans climbed to meet them. Then, the dance began, and it was a dance that confused the operators on the ground. The American F-14s turned away. "They are breaking off," a Libyan controller shouted. The radar showed the F-14s banking hard to the left, creating lateral separation. To the Libyan pilots, this looked like fear. They believed the Americans were trying to avoid a head-on engagement. The lead MiG pilot aggressively turned his nose to follow the Americans. He was cutting off their angle, forcing his way into their path. The Americans turned back, straightening out. Then, they turned away again. 5 times. 5 times the F-14s maneuvered to avoid a direct confrontation. 5 times, the Libyan MiG-23 aircraft countered, turning their noses directly at the American fighters to maintain a collision course. This wasn't an accidental meeting. The Libyans were hunting. The Soviet advisors watched the geometry with narrowing eyes. The Libyan pilots were doing everything right according to the manual. They were keeping their noses on the target, illuminating the Americans with their radar to achieve a lock for their R-23 missiles. But inside the cockpit of the MiG-23, the pilots were struggling with a ghost. Their radar warning receivers were chirping, indicating they were being painted by the American radar. But they couldn't get a clean shoot cue. The American jets were there, but they were slippery. Every time the MiGs tried to lock on, the F-14s shifted, changed altitude, or jammed the signal. The distance collapsed. 14 miles. Fox 1, the American lead pilot called out. The Soviet advisors froze. 14 miles was a long shot. The Americans had fired a radar-guided AIM-7 Sparrow missile. The Libyan pilots didn't even see it coming until it was too late to react, but the missile failed to track. It fell harmlessly into the sea. A second missile was fired. It also failed. For a brief second, hope flared in the bunker. The American tech was failing. The vaunted Sparrow missiles were duds. The MiGs were now inside 10 miles. This was knife-fighting range. The MiG-23s accelerated, preparing to unleash their own missiles. They had closed the gap. They had survived the long-range barrage. Now, they would win the dogfight. The distance was 6 miles. The F-14s suddenly split. They didn't run. They expanded their formation, creating a wide bracket that forced the Libyan pilots to choose a target. The coordination was instantaneous. Fox 1. Another Sparrow missile erupted from the rail of the lead F-14. This time, the motor burned bright and true. It covered the 6 miles in seconds. The lead MiG-23 pilot never had a chance to eject. The missile impacted the fuselage, vaporizing the aircraft in a cloud of debris and fire. The wingman was now alone. He was flying a high-performance interceptor capable of Mach 2. He was angry and he was armed. He had a visual on the American jet that had just killed his leader. He began to turn, trying to bring his weapons to bear. He was focused entirely on the killer in front of him. He forgot about the second American. Gypsy 207, the wingman F-14, had maneuvered unseen during the chaos. He wasn't behind the MiG. He was off to the side, in a tight turn. He was pulling into a position that technically shouldn't have offered a firing solution. The angle was too high. The closure rate was too fast for a heat-seeking missile. Fox 2, an AIM-9 Sidewinder, leaped off the rail. It snaked through the air, ignoring the sun, ignoring the flares, locking onto the heat of the MiG's engine from a side aspect. It slammed into the MiG-23's tailpipe. The explosion severed the controls instantly. The pilot punched out, his parachute blooming white against the blue water of the Gulf. The engagement was over. In the command bunker, the silence was heavier than it had been in 1981. This wasn't a fluke. This wasn't an inferior aircraft problem. The MiG-23 was a capable modern fighter. The pilots had been aggressive. They had forced the merge. They had survived the first volley. And yet, the result was exactly the same. 0 losses for the Americans, 2 losses for the Libyans. The Soviet analysts began to replay the radar tapes, looking for the mistake. They looked for the pilot error. But as they watched the tracks, a terrifying realization began to dawn on them. The Americans hadn't just outflown the MiGs, they had outprocessed them. During those 5 turns, those maneuvers that looked like the Americans were running away, the F-14s weren't fleeing. They were calibrating. They were setting up the board. The analysts noticed that the American radar seemed to hold a lock on the MiGs, even while the F-14s were turning violently. The MiGs, by comparison, lost lock every time they maneuvered. The MiG-23 radar had a narrow field of view. To see the target, the nose had to point at the target. The F-14, it seemed, could see everything, everywhere, all at once. The question that haunted the Soviet military attaché that night wasn't about missiles or engines, it was about information. How could the American pilots maintain such perfect situational awareness while maneuvering at 600 knots? How did they know exactly when to turn, when to fire, and when to split? They were missing a piece of the puzzle. There was a ghost in the machine, something inside the F-14 that gave it an unfair advantage, something that allowed a 2-man crew to function with the coordination of a computer. The answer lay in a system the Soviets knew existed, but had vastly underestimated. A system that turned the F-14 from a mere fighter plane into a flying supercomputer. And to understand why the MiGs never stood a chance, we have to look inside the cockpit of the Tomcat, at a weapon that fired no bullets but killed with devastating efficiency. The data tapes from the Gulf of Sidra eventually made their way north, smuggled in diplomatic pouches from Tripoli to the grey, austere offices of the Soviet military intelligence in Moscow. There, amidst the hum of fluorescent lights and cigarette smoke, engineers and tacticians stared at the flight paths. They were trying to reverse engineer a ghost. To understand the depth of their confusion, you have to understand the Soviet philosophy of air combat in the 1980s. In the East, the pilot was the tip of a spear held by a commander on the ground. This was the doctrine of ground control intercept, or GCI. The pilot flew the plane, but the GCI operator in the bunker told him where to go, when to turn, and when to shoot. The radar on a Soviet fighter like the MiG-23 was powerful, but it was like a flashlight beam in a dark room, intense but narrow. If the pilot looked left, he was blind to the right. The ground controller was his eyes. But in the Libyan engagements, the GCI system had failed. The ground controllers had screamed vectors, but the Americans were always one step ahead. As the analysts traced the jagged lines of the F-14's flight paths on the plotting tables, a disturbing pattern emerged. The American fighters moved with a strange, fluid autonomy. They didn't fly like soldiers following orders. They flew like hunters who could see through walls. The focus of the investigation narrowed on the offset maneuvers. In the 1989 engagement, the F-14s had turned away from the MiGs 5 times. In a standard Soviet fighter, turning your nose away from the enemy meant losing radar lock. You would be blind. You would have to reacquire the target when you turned back, costing precious seconds. But the F-14s never lost lock. "They are tracking while turning," one analyst noted, pointing to the timestamps. "The radar is looking sideways." This was the first clue. The American radar wasn't fixed to the nose of the aircraft in the traditional sense. It had a mechanical and electronic independence that allowed the aircraft to maneuver violently without snapping the invisible tether to its target. But the mystery went deeper than just the radar dish. It was about the workload. Flying a supersonic fighter is physically and mentally exhausting. You are managing fuel, checking engine instruments, listening to the radio, watching for threats, and trying to fly the plane. To also manage a complex radar intercept, interpret the return signals, and calculate firing solutions was nearing the limit of human capacity. The Soviet solution was to offload that work to the ground controller. The Americans had done the opposite. They had put the controller inside the plane. The Soviet advisors looked at the schematics of the F-14. It was a massive aircraft, far larger than the MiG-21 or MiG-23. It was heavy, expensive, and complex. And it had 2 seats. For years, Soviet propaganda had dismissed the 2-seat concept as a weakness proof that American avionics were too complicated for one man to handle. They called the second crewman baggage. But as they analyzed the Sidra timeline, they realized the second man wasn't baggage. He was the reason the Libyans were dead. While the pilot, the stick actuator, was focused on flying the energy management of the jet, making sure they didn't stall or crash, the man in the back was doing something else entirely. He wasn't looking out the window. He was looking at a screen. The intelligence reports began to piece together a picture of a divided brain. The F-14 wasn't one fighter. It was 2 distinct specialized units sharing a fuselage. The front seat was the brawn, the back seat was the brain. But a brain needs data. And this is where the Soviet understanding of the event hit a wall. Even with 2 men, how could they track multiple targets, prioritize threats, and maintain situational awareness in a chaotic 3-dimensional battle space? The MiG-23 radar showed a cluttered mess of green lines. How were the Americans seeing a clear picture? There were rumors of a specific component in the American naval inventory. A radar system so powerful, it had been originally designed not for dogfighting, but for stopping waves of Soviet nuclear bombers. The Soviets knew the name of the system, the AWG-9. But they thought of it as a brute force instrument, a long-range sledgehammer. What they saw in Libya was not a sledgehammer, it was a scalpel. The Americans had used this heavy, long-range system to win a close-range knife fight. They had taken a system designed to protect aircraft carriers and used it to dismantle a pair of agile fighters in seconds. The realization was chilling. The F-14 crews weren't guessing. They weren't hoping. They knew exactly where the MiGs were, how fast they were going, and what they were doing. Even when the F-14s were flying in the opposite direction, they had achieved information dominance. The Soviet advisors in Tripoli had to face a hard truth. Their pilots were brave. Their MiG-23 aircraft were fast. But they had been sent into a digital arena with analog tools. They were trying to play chess while blindfolded, against an opponent who could see the entire board. But what exactly was the board? What was the specific technology that allowed the man in the back seat to see the future? The answer wasn't just the radar dish itself. It was the interface. It was a glowing green circle that changed the history of aerial warfare, a display that processed raw chaos into pure, actionable death. The shock that finally settled over the Soviet military establishment wasn't about the airframe. It wasn't about the engines. It was about a single heavy component housed in the nose of the Tomcat, the Hughes AWG-9 weapons control system. For decades, the standard for radar was search and track. You searched the sky until you found a blip. Then, you locked onto it. But the moment you locked on, you became tunnel-visioned. Your radar focused all its energy on that one target to guide a missile, leaving you blind to everything else in the sky. If a second enemy appeared, you wouldn't see him. The AWG-9 changed the laws of physics. The ghost, the Soviet analysts had failed to identify, was a mode called track while scan, or TWS. Inside the F-14, the radar intercept officer, the man in the back seat, wasn't looking at a chaotic mess of raw radar returns like his Soviet counterparts. He was looking at the TID, the tactical information display. It was a large, round glass screen that didn't show the world as it was. It showed the world as a computer understood it. This was the revelation that terrified the Kremlin. The Americans had stopped showing their pilots raw data. They were processing it. On the TID, the Libyan MiGs weren't just fuzzy green blobs. They were distinct symbols. The computer assigned each target a vector, a speed, and an altitude. But the true horror was the capacity. The AWG-9 could track 24 separate targets simultaneously while continuing to scan the rest of the sky for new threats. It could calculate firing solutions for 6 of them at the same time. While the Libyan pilot in his MiG-23 was frantically adjusting knobs, trying to keep his radar dish pointed at the American jet, the F-14's computer was calmly building a 3-dimensional map of the entire Gulf of Sidra. This explained the impossible maneuvering. In the 1989 engagement, when the F-14s turned away from the MiGs, they weren't guessing. The AWG-9 radar dish was mechanically gimbaled to sweep vast angles. The F-14 could turn 90 degrees away from the enemy, but the radar dish would swivel to stay locked on. The computer held the track. The RIO in the back seat could simply watch the MiGs on his screen, calm and detached, while his pilot flew a radical defensive maneuver. They were playing a video game while the Libyans were fighting for their lives. But the technological gap went even deeper. It was the look-down divided by shoot-down capability. For the entire Cold War, the safest place to be was down low. If you flew close to the water or the ground, the enemy radar would be confused by the ground clutter, the reflection of radar waves off the waves or terrain. A MiG flying at 100 feet was invisible to most radars looking down from above. The AWG-9 used pulse Doppler technology. It didn't just look for reflections, it looked for movement. It used the Doppler shift to filter out the stationary background of the Earth and see only the objects moving toward it. This meant there was nowhere to hide. When the Libyan MiGs took off in 1981 and 1989, they thought they could use the clutter of the Mediterranean to mask their approach. They were wrong. The F-14s saw them the moment they left the runway. Every move they made, every turn, every acceleration was being fed into a central processor that was light years ahead of anything the Soviet Union could mass produce. The shock for the Soviet advisors was the realization of a fundamental obsolescence. They had built their air force around the concept of superior aerodynamics, faster planes, tighter turns. They believed the pilot with the most courage and the best stick and rudder skills would win. The Gulf of Sidra proved that the era of the dogfight was ending. The era of the systems manager had begun. The American Rio wasn't just a passenger. He was the battle commander. He decided when the engagement began. He decided who died. In the 1989 incident, the communications tapes reveal the RIOs, not the pilots, calling the shots. "Center, bogies have jinked back into me. Master arm on. Shoot!" The voice was calm, clinical. The missiles that destroyed the MiGs, the Sparrows and Sidewinders were just the final executioners. The real weapon was the microchip. The F-14 was the first fighter jet to utilize a central air data computer that could automatically adjust the sweep of the wings to the perfect angle for the current speed and altitude. It optimized the plane so the pilot didn't have to think about flying, he only had to think about killing. By the time the debris of the MiG-23 aircraft settled on the waves, the Soviet military doctrine was in ruins. They realized they were preparing for a knife fight against an opponent who had brought a sniper rifle with a digital scope. The parity of the Cold War skies was a myth. The Americans didn't just have better planes, they had better information. And information, as it turned out, was more lethal than speed. The ripples of the Gulf of Sidra did not stop at the water's edge. They traveled thousands of miles north to the Soviet Union, crashing into the rigid structures of the military-industrial complex. The 45 seconds of combat in 1981 and the surgical dismantling of the Libyan Air Force in 1989 forced a quiet but desperate revolution in Moscow. For decades, the Soviet Union had relied on quantity. They believed that if they built enough MiG-21 and MiG-23 fighters, they could overwhelm Western technology with sheer numbers. But the Sidra incidents proved that numbers were irrelevant if you couldn't see the enemy. A blind man cannot fight a sniper, no matter how many friends he brings with him. The panic in the Soviet design bureaus was palpable. The realization that the Americans had perfected the look-down divided by shoot-down capability accelerated the development of the next generation of Soviet fighters. The designers at Mikoyan and Sukhoi worked around the clock to close the gap. The direct result was the expedited deployment of the MiG-31 Foxhound and the Su-27 Flanker. These were the first Soviet aircraft equipped with radars capable of engaging targets against the background of the Earth, finally trying to match the standard set by the AWG-9 system nearly a decade earlier. But the hardware was only half the problem. The software, the microchips, the processors, the complex algorithms that allowed the F-14 to track 24 targets at once was a chasm the Soviet Union could never fully cross before its collapse. They were trying to catch up to the digital age with an analog economy. The legacy of the F-14 Tomcat, however, is filled with irony. To the general public, the F-14 was the star of the movie Top Gun. It was a symbol of speed, rebellion, and acrobatic dogfighting. But the reality exposed in the Gulf of Sidra was far more clinical. The F-14 wasn't a rebel, it was a disciplined system. It didn't win because of maverick flying, it won because of cold, hard math. The Sidra engagements were actually anomalies. The F-14 was never really designed to dogfight MiGs at close range. Its primary purpose was to launch the massive AIM-54 Phoenix missile from 100 miles away, destroying Soviet bomber fleets before they could even see the American aircraft carrier. The fact that the Tomcat could step out of its role as a long-range interceptor, enter a chaotic high-G merging fight, and still completely dominate agile fighters like the MiG-23 was the ultimate testament to its design. It was a sledgehammer that could fence. By the early 2000s, the world had changed. The Soviet Union was gone, the Cold War was over, the threat of a massive bomber armada vanished. The F-14, with its high maintenance costs and complex variable sweep wings, became a relic of a different era. On September 22nd, 2006, the last F-14 Tomcat catapulted off the deck of an American carrier. It was retired, replaced by the F-18 Super Hornet, a cheaper, more reliable, but arguably less romantic aircraft. However, the ghost of the Tomcat lives on in every modern fighter jet flying today. The concept that was proven over the Gulf of Sidra that information is the deadliest weapon is now the foundation of modern aerial warfare. The F-22 Raptor and the F-35 Lightning II are not designed to outturn the enemy. They are designed to out-think them. They are sensor fusion platforms, vacuuming up data and presenting it to the pilot, just as the RIO used to do in the backseat of the Tomcat. The pilot is no longer just a stick and rudder operator. He is a systems administrator in the sky. When we look back at the footage of those falling Libyan MiGs, we aren't just seeing a victory for the United States Navy. We are seeing the moment warfare changed. We are seeing the end of the Red Baron era of visceral, visual combat and the beginning of the Silicon era, where the battle is won on a circuit board long before the missiles are even fired. The Libyan pilots never stood a chance. They were fighting a war of courage and reflexes against a machine that had solved the equation of their death before they even left the ground. The F-14 Tomcat may be in the boneyard, sitting in the desert sun, its titanium wings forever swept back. But the lesson it taught the world in those 45 seconds remains the gold standard of air power. Speed is life, but information is victory.